Thank you, Dan, for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be taking part in this online conference today. It's certainly a first for me, and I hope it goes well. I know many of you listening are used to hearing about PPI happening in a research context. But today I'm going to broaden the scope of that understanding of PPI and talk about how we might apply PPI in the policy-making process. And I'm going to draw from some examples of work I've been doing in the Centre for Economic and Social Research on Dementia in NUI Galway with colleagues and with partner organisations such as the National Dementia Office and the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland. So I'm speaking from the context of a researcher working in this area. Now, policy is a word we probably all use a lot, but we may not all be very clear on what exactly a policy is and the process of making a policy. So policy is basically a set of ideas or plans that form the basis of making decisions, often in the context of kind of politics or business or economics. And today I'm going to talk about health policy. And health policy in Ireland is made by the Department of Health. And so ways that we've tried to do that, particularly in the area of dementia, I'm going to give you some examples now. To give you a framework, just to kind of structure the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about some stages of the policy cycle and some examples under each of those stages. Now, this is a very idealised portrayal of the policy-making process with these 5 clear stages happening in a nice linear manner. Of course, the reality is probably much more like this. It's often called a messy process. So there's a lot of toing and froing. There can be dead ends. It can take time to move from one stage to another. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to keep it nice and straightforward. And the first 2 examples I'm going to talk about relate to the agenda setting process. So what should this policy be about, and what are the policy options in this area? And I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first is a policy cafe, and the second is a carers assembly. So the policy cafe was very much a co-produced event with 10 people with dementia. And it was, in fact, several years in the process. So I was having conversations with different people with dementia and ways we might try and directly influence policy. So they've been involved in the very beginning around topic selection, the format, and so on. We used what's called a World Cafe method. And the idea of that is that it's informal and it's relaxed, and it can be a fun and enjoyable process to participate in, because let's face it, policy can be a bit off-putting and a bit of a dry process. So we had conversations on home care and diagnosis in the Policy Cafe. It was a half-day event. And we used different media to try and help capture the outputs so that we could disseminate them widely. We used film, we used animation or illustration, and we used note-taking. So the focus was very much on impacting policy for dementia in these 2 areas of home care and diagnosis. And when the conversation was straying off, we would bring it back to, okay, what do we want if there's a new policy here, what would we like to see written down so that will really change things for the better for the future? So some of the key messages that emerged from that process were, for example, the importance of a social model of home care, of a clear pathway, trained carers, the importance of statutory basis for home care, and under diagnosis, proactively linking to services, the right to know your diagnosis, and so on. You can see the messages there. I won't read them all. And this was, these are some of the illustrations. We had an illustrator take part in the event, and this is a great way of capturing the discussion, and it really helped people who maybe weren't engaging with written material so well to engage with the process, and it sparked lots of conversation and discussion. I'm going to show you a brief clip of the Policy Cafe film, and it'll give you a sense of a flavour of what happened on the day.
I think it's a brilliant idea. What I love about it is the fact that it's people with dementia are being listened to. and that's taken a long, long time. We're the people that know, we're the experts. So when we're here today and we're able to put down what we think we need, what we know we need, what we think our carers will need, it's very, very important to have our voice heard.
It went from maybe something's wrong to give up your work, give up your job,
yes,
give up life,
you
know. And now I'm fighting back now. But this isn't an illness that is predominantly of old people anymore. And so we need to speak up and say that we need help from policy, we need help from government, and we need help to have something that goes right across our country.
The next example I'm going to talk about is the Carers Assembly. And this was a forum to bring together and hear the views of 30 family carers who participated. And they were carers of people with dementia. And we really wanted to get their view in relation to issues around dementia care in Ireland. And the method we used was modelled on the Citizens' Assembly. And that involved presentations on various topics at the beginning of the day. It was a whole day event. And these were then discussed by carers, and they directly inputted into what should be on the ballot at the end of the day that they would be voting on, to try and prioritise and rank the issues that we were talking about. So again, it was very much a kind of a co-produced and participative event. So just an example of one of the ballot papers here. So the items in black, this was looking at what would formulate or form part of quality home care. The items in black were those that had been decided at the outset, having consulted with groups of carers. And then the items in red were added by carers on the day. Just keeping an eye at the time here. Were added by carers on the day to make sure that the full range of views was represented. And the key messages, so there were 4 key themes addressed on the day. And at the end of the day, there was a private ballot to rank those in order of importance. And you can see the ranking there. Home care services was first, economic support, so for example, carers allowance and so on, was second. The provision of respite care was third, and different forms of social support were fourth. And under each of these items then, there was a series of priorities relating to each of these. So again, it was very interesting way to get to have carers involved in prioritising what was important for them. I'm going to show again a little short clip of the film that was made on the day at the Carers Assembly, again to give you a flavour of what happened there.
I share the care of both my parents with my sister. My sister is the main carer and I support her in her role. And my mother has more than one type of dementia and she also suffers with Parkinson's, and I love my role as a carer.
I have 2 siblings, 2 brothers, twin brother and a younger brother, and together we care for my mother, who is living alone still. She's probably living with dementia for about 6 or 7 years now.
I cared for my late wife through all stages of early onset dementia. She was just 57 when she got the illness and died 3 years ago at the age 66.
Today we're bringing carers into a room, asking you to think about issues for carers. For us, this is a very important meeting because it gives us an opportunity to have your voice help us to think about what are the real priorities for people who are looking after people with dementia or who need care.
So the next part of the policy cycle I'm going to talk about again is around formulating policy options and how we might move then to making decisions about policy, what should be in the policy. And the example I'm going to give you here is called a policy dialogue. And this happened towards the end of 2019, in December 2019. And a policy dialogue is an event that brings together, is really focused on bringing evidence to bear on policy and also bringing a multi-stakeholder perspective. So it's about bringing evidence along with experience and the views of a range of stakeholders. And the stakeholders that took part in the policy dialogue on home care was researchers to bring the evidence, the policymakers, and this was people from the Department of Health, and people from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and HICWA. And then people using services were directly involved, home care service providers, people from the HSE and other agencies. And because it's a multi-stakeholder event, there were 24 of these different stakeholders and a number of researchers also. We wanted to make sure that the voice of people using services was sufficiently represented, and we used film to do that. So we brought the films that you've seen, clips of, films from the Policy Cafe and the Carers Assembly, and showed them so that, as well as the participants who were there was 4 of the 30 who were directly using services. We wanted to make sure that this was a good way of bringing the outputs from those 2 events directly to bear on policy discussions. So the Department of Health is developing a new home care scheme. And this will be a very significant, I believe, the biggest thing that's happened in home care for several decades. So we partnered with the Department of Health in this policy dialogue. And what we wanted to achieve on the day were to obtain participants' views on particular topics relating to the new home care scheme. So what should be within the scope of the home care scheme, how should it be funded, and so on. And we also wanted to get further insight into what consensus might look like in these particular areas, and also where consensus might be lacking. So we were really keen to bring voices and evidence and views together that would inform the development of the new home care scheme, and to create a space where, you know, particularly issues that can be difficult, you know, so in relation to funding, how should we fund something like this? Where should responsibility lie between the state, between families, between people using home care? And this was a forum where that could happen. We also filmed the policy dialogue, and I won't show you that for purposes of time today, but there are links to all the films at the end of this presentation. The next example I want to give you in terms of the policy cycle is around policy implementation. And this is around, say, advisory committees and oversight groups. And these are fora, again, that you may be more familiar with. So these 2 examples, as a research centre, we're not directly involved in organising these or running these, although we are participating on them as researchers and bringing that expertise. The first one is the National Dementia Strategy Implementation Monitoring Group, and a person with dementia, a family carer, and the National Advocacy Organisation are members of that group. And the National Dementia Office is responsible for implementing the actions of the National Dementia Strategy. And they have a number of advisory groups around some of those actions. And people with dementia, again, are members of those advisory groups. And implementation is where the rubber really hits the road, if you like. So this is where real actions are being put in place and real changes are being brought about. And people with dementia, again, are at the table in terms of how that is happening. The final example I'm going to talk about is policy evaluation. So this is, you know, establishing whether a policy is working and how well it's working. And this is where research and evaluation comes into play. And this, I'm only giving you one brief example here because I think this is PPI in research and evaluation, if you like, which is what many of you will be familiar with. So the example I'm going to talk about here briefly is how we developed a brief wellbeing measure. So myself and colleagues, Professor Eamon O'Shea and Dr Maria Pearce, were asked to evaluate the post-diagnostic support programme. And this is an action directly arising from the National Dementia Strategy. So a number of post-diagnostic support interventions were put in place around the country. And we wanted to find out how well these were working for the people taking part in those, so people with dementia and carers. And we wanted to develop just a very brief measure of well-being. So we drafted that, and we went to a group of people with dementia in Kilkenny and got their input directly into that measure. How well it worked for them. Did it make sense? Were they able to understand the different items? And which ones really rang a bell for them? And this worked really well, and we were able to whittle down the number of questions we asked and make it directly relevant for people with dementia. So drawn across these examples and the work we've been doing really over a number of years, bit about PPI, and particularly PPI in trying to create impact. And we've tried to synthesize these lessons and these learnings, and I have three, I suppose, main points to make here. The first is that to do PPI well in policy, in research, in any aspect really does take time, especially when you're working with people who may have additional needs. In this case, we work with people with dementia. So you really need to build relationships. So people need to be able to trust that what they talk to you about will be presented well, it won't be sensationalized, and so on. So it takes time to prepare that and to do well. You need to pay attention to the details. It's the little things that really count and can make an event work very well, or, you know, make it just stumble along. One of the things we found very important is tailoring the support we provide to the specific and different needs of each of the PPI contributors. So, for example, a couple of people are finding it difficult now to follow written communication, and it's, their dementia is affecting their visual abilities. So we provide different types of support to people with those needs as opposed to others who may need other support. So it's important to tailor that. I think it is important in any PPI endeavour to respect and to balance all expertise. So no single expertise trumps the others. And we need to remember that individuals, they have their own priorities that are based on their own experiences that may not be representative. So when we're distilling down what we've learned, we need to make sure that the messages have wider relevance. And the principles of validity and rigour that we bring to research remain important in this endeavour as well. It's important to be creative and open. So we've adapted different methods, existing methods, to involve people with dementia and carers in innovative ways in the policy making process. And also to use different media to communicate. So again, as I've mentioned, the illustrations were really useful in this regard, made it very accessible for the people taking part. And my final slide is about how we've brought this together. So we've co-produced a set of guidelines with the Irish Dementia Working Group and the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland. And that really brings together best practice guidance on involving people with dementia in these different events that might take place, policy consultations, policy development, conferences, and so on. And this is a beautiful piece of artwork that's going to grace the cover of this production, and that's been done by a member of the Irish Dementia Working Group, Marguerite Keating, and really lovely piece. And those guidelines should be out very soon. I'm going to finish there. I hope you found this a useful contribution, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge my collaborators and contributors and the funding from the Health Research Board, and links to the films are here. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Excellent, Fiona. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences of PPI in policymaking, and what powerful videos. Those joining us, please enter any questions you have in the chat. And Fiona, I might start by asking you about one aspect of your presentation. Enabling our PPI contributors to be part of decision making is really central to kind of meaningful and effective involvement in PPI. You've given us some innovative methods that you went about doing this. How did you come up with those ways? The question I'm always asked is there a how-to guide for this and that? So how did you come about and develop your decision-making aspects of your work?
Well, I suppose it's probably just from being, you know, in this space for a while and coming across different methods, and I suppose having an open mind and thinking that might be, we could adapt that and use it. So the Citizens Assembly was a really good example, and excuse me, we were there listening to it in discussing different topics. It got a lot of media coverage. And myself and Eamon in the centre were thinking that might be a good way of bringing a group together and giving the power to them to prioritise issues that are important to them. So we took a good look at the methods in the Citizens Assembly, which are publicly available, and adapted it. And then again, policy dialogue is a method that's used quite a bit in Canada. And I really liked it as a way of, as researchers, we're always looking for ways to directly influence the policy process as much as we can. And this is a very, I think, useful way of doing that. Again, it's been very well described. And the Policy Cafe then came up as in the course of just different conversations with people, and we'd be often in cafes chatting about these kind of weighty issues and thinking, we could do just something like this, have a bigger version of this. Yeah, so variety of sources.
Right, so really adaptation, innovation seems to be the key message for you. There's a question coming in there from somebody about, you mentioned balancing the different expertise as being important. Any particular tips on how you go about doing that?
I think the kind of the nature and the tone of engagement from the very beginning is very important, and it's helpful to really kind of clarify kind of people's roles and their own each person's expertise. You know, this is often kind of very informally done in the rounds of introduction around a table, and actually usefully in inputting in developing those guidelines I spoke about at the very end of the presentation. One of the things that the people in the Irish Dementia Working Group were very keen to have included in those guidelines was just a small piece on those meetings we're all very familiar with, where it goes around, and this is Fiona Keogh and she's a researcher, and this is so-and-so and they are an eminent professor or a consultant in this, that or the other. And this is this person's name, and then we move on, and they're not given a formal role. They are the person they are usually the person who is directly experienced the condition or the service, and that's why they are there. So in the guidelines, we actually set out the way that should be done very clearly, because again, I think it's often, you know, people haven't thought it through, and people are introducing and they think, oh, what should I say? And there's sometimes an awkward pause. So the wording that we came up with was, my name is, I'll use my own, Fiona Keogh. I'm a member of the Irish Dementia Working Group, and I'm here today because I'm living with dementia, or whatever the condition that might be that the person is representing. So that's simple, but it's a very nice way of just saying, I'm here at this table on the same basis as everybody else, and I think also then, you know, respecting each person's contribution, even though there will be disagreements and so on.
Okay, so it is about everybody buying into the idea of balancing the expertise. Okay, there's a number of questions coming in, Fiona, but I think they're for a different conference, around how to get the policymakers to the table and where, you know, was there resistance there. But we'll keep the focus, because we only have time really for one more question. Keep the focus more on PPI aspects. And there are a number of people asking the question around, you know, did you get ethical approval for your carers assembly, or in particular for you know, where you have your people with dementia at the table? How did you handle the ethical aspects of what is PPI?
Yes, this is always comes up, and we did actually. So we were lucky enough to get a KEDS Knowledge Exchange and Dissemination grant from the Health Research Board, and as on the foot of that, then we submitted an ethics application that would cover all 3 events. But we kind of, you know, the way we described that was very much as PPI. So it was, you know, people as contributors in that process. So we kind of wrote it in that style. And just address briefly those points that are being raised of bringing the policymakers to the table. I think actually PPI done well is a very good way of really involving policymakers, because they are genuinely, certainly all the ones I've been working with, concerned and interested in getting the views of real people who are using the services and have direct experience. So if they are presented with a good way of doing that, and that does it well, is very inclusive, is robust, and so on, that's a good way of actually engaging policymakers. They're interested in that.
Absolutely, bringing the personal story, the lived experience right to the policy table. Okay, Fiona, we could actually stay talking here all day, but we have to move on to our next presentation. So a big thank you for being brave enough to go first, and thank you very much for your presentation.